Welcome to the Touch MBA Admissions Podcast. Do you need help figuring out which schools to apply to or how to get into the world's top MBA programs? Hey, you're not alone. Join thousands of others on this podcast and on our site, touchmba.com, as they seek the admissions edge. And now, here's your host, Darren Joe.
What's up, guys? Welcome to the Touch MBA podcast. This is Darren. I've been mulling over this episode for, at least a couple months. I actually kind of wrote the outlines for it back in 2018. It's taken me a while to get around to it, but I'm really excited about this episode. I was thinking of calling it like Touch MBA Labs, like experimental techniques to help you with your MBA application. And in this episode, I want to talk about Kishotenketsu. And I'm probably butchering that pronunciation for those of you Japanese speakers out there. But essentially, this is a new way of storytelling. We've talked about story on this podcast, 5, 6, 7 episodes. And I'll link to all those episodes on storytelling in the show notes. Probably the most well-received episode was episode 32, How to Tell Your Best Story, with my good friend John Kayahello. And we'll circle back to that episode. But basically, all of the storytelling episodes here at Touch MBA have really been focused on the Western story structure that necessitates having a big conflict that the main character has to overcome, whether that's internal, external, what have you. But I was reading a book by one of my favorite authors, Charles Eisenstein, and I stumbled across this term, Kishotenketsu. And when I read about it, I actually couldn't believe it. It's, I guess you could say, an Eastern form of storytelling, or one that has been used by Japanese and Chinese storytellers for centuries. It just really rocked my world. I mean, these are the types of things that rock my world, learning new story structures. I stayed up, a couple more hours, I remember that night, just thinking about it and reflecting upon my own life and just being kind of amazed about its possibilities. Its possibilities for your MBA application, its possibilities for storytelling, and just life in general. So what is Kishotenketsu? And I'm going to take this definition from stilleatingoranges.tumblr.com, which has a great essay on Kishotenketsu. Kishōtenketsu contains 4 acts: introduction, development, twist, and reconciliation. The basics of the story, characters, setting, etc. are established in the first act and developed in the second. No major changes occur until the third act, in which a new, often surprising element is introduced. The third act is the core of the plot, and it may be thought of as a kind of structural non sequitur. The fourth act draws a conclusion from the contrast between the first 2 straight acts and the disconnected third, thereby reconciling them into a coherent whole. Kishotenketsu is probably best known to Westerners as the structure of Japanese yonkoma 4-panel manga. And I've also heard that this concept has been used in game design, especially in Nintendo's video games, in games such as Super Mario. So let me tell a story that might help illuminate this new story structure, this story structure that doesn't require conflict, but rather requires just a shift in perspective. A young farmer was covered with sweat as he paddled his boat up the river. He was going upstream to deliver his produce to the village. It was a hot day, and he wanted to make his delivery and get home before dark. As he looked ahead, he spied another vessel, heading rapidly downstream towards his boat. He rowed furiously to get out of the way, but it didn't seem to help. He shouted, "Change direction! You're going to hit me!" to no avail. The vessel hit his boat with a violent thud. He cried out, "You idiot! How could you manage to hit my boat in the middle of this wide river?" As he glared into the boat, seeking out the individual responsible for the accident, he realized no one was there. He had been screaming at an empty boat that had broken free of its moorings and was floating downstream with the current. So I really like this boat story because it's not about a conflict, it's about a shift in perspective. So this guy in his boat thought someone rode into him, but it turned out it was just an empty boat. How can this story structure without conflict be useful for your MBA application? Well, top business schools these days are really looking for applicants who can bring unique and multiple perspectives to our classroom. In fact, if you come to our site, touchmba.com, to get free school selection help or to get some pointers on how to improve your profile, you'll see that one point that we rank you on is for multidimensionality. That's what we call it. And we define this as evidence of self-awareness and life experience. Another way we could define this criteria or multidimensionality is you have different lenses to view the world, different lenses to view business. So this is really about showing that you're open to new perspectives, you're open to new lenses to view the world, and you're willing to be transformed, right? This is what top MBA programs want from applicants, right? They want applicants who are open to new perspectives, who are open to having their lens of the world change and be colored a different way, who are willing to be transformed. So this bringing of different perspectives and openness to new perspectives is a really important quality that I think many top business schools are looking for these days. Secondly, as an applicant, let's face it, not all of us have Hollywood movie-like stories full of conflict and obstacles that we overcome. I know I sure don't. So I think many applicants to top business schools feel like they had to have this huge life event, and then it caused them to, start a nonprofit that's saving the world. I mean, that's the stereotypical idea that many applicants have of the ideal business school applicant, right? Someone who has just done something amazing, overcome insurmountable odds. But the truth of the matter is, not all of us have those amazing stories. I think what many of us do have is this willingness, this curiosity to explore new perspectives and new lenses. If this is the case for you, then Kishōtenketsu could be the right storytelling format to use in your application, as it generates interest not through conflict, but by contrast. Practically, where could you apply Kishōtenketsu in your application? If you think about your application as a book, maybe the first two acts are your resume and your essay. But then in your third act, which is the twist, right? Maybe you get a recommendation from someone unexpected or someone that brings a completely new perspective to who you are as a person or what your career goals are or what your life passions are. So what I'm saying here is you can use various elements of the application to provide that twist, that shift in perspective, whether it's the third essay, whether it's a recommendation that shows a completely new side of you, whether in your interview you bring up, something that the admissions team had no idea about, this new lens of seeing the world. So you can apply that third twist act to various parts of your application. You could also apply it within those elements. So probably the most common example I can think of is really taking advantage of that extracurricular / hobbies / interests section of your resume. And I've discussed this on a previous podcast, right? But typically in a resume, you're going to see an applicant's work experience, their education, and then their interests and hobbies at the very end. And usually most applicants only save a couple centimeters for those. Well, those extracurriculars can really provide that change of perspective, that third act. For example, and I've mentioned this applicant a couple times, but I helped one applicant who was a silicon chip engineer. He had kind of the typical engineering education, work history, and in his interests, he just mentioned photography and cycling, just as two words. What we helped him do was really flesh out the power and the interest he had in those hobbies, right? And showed that he'd been spending his weekends taking photos for many, many years and had this, amazing portfolio of photographs on his website. I think those are kind of the shifts of perspectives, the breaking of expectations that keep admissions officers' attention. And I covered this all the way back in episode 4. You want to try to be a pleasant novelty if possible. So what I mean by being a pleasant novelty is violating the readers, in this case, the admissions committee's expectations in a pleasing way. Back to this case of the engineer who's the photographer, that kind of violates the stereotype of an engineer. Or maybe it was the Russian consultant who was working for BCG, who was also a championship wrestler. Like, those things don't really fit together, but they definitely shift the reader's perspective of the candidate. So I think you can use Kishotenketsu in your resume. You could use it in your essays. Like, maybe one essay really just shows this different side of you that admissions officers weren't expecting, show this new lens you could bring to the world. So it's not just a different way of seeing you, but you could also use this concept to show that you have self-awareness. What I mean by this is, for example, maybe in your career goals essay, maybe you actually had this moment of realization that you were meant to, whatever it is, be an entrepreneur, be in finance, or whatever it is. Sometimes those realizations aren't a result of you overcoming these obstacles and passing all these tests, ranking number 1 in your field, whatever it is. Sometimes it's as simple as maybe a friend saying something to you, or being appreciated by someone else for doing something that you didn't think was any big deal. Maybe it was a completely random chance that you found out you had this talent or this passion for this type of work, right? I think that happens for a lot of us who have found things we love to do. So this is an example of how you could bring Kishōtenketsu into your essay itself to show that, all of a sudden you had this change in perspective, which led you to do A, B, and C. And being able to reflect on these moments, being able to reflect on this self-awareness is really, again, going back to what I said, what admissions officers are looking for in applicants. So to kind of make this even more practical, I think you can ask yourself 2 questions as you go about designing your application. The first is, what quote-unquote empty boat or quote-unquote aha moments have changed your life, have changed your career, have changed your outlook on life? In episode 32, How to Tell Your Best Story with John Hello, the story that is so memorable from that episode is of him stirring mashed potatoes with Mac, who worked in his high school cafeteria, and having that moment of bonding with the chef, and how that spoke so much to how dislocated he felt at the boarding school he was attending. For me, just to give an example, when I had just first started Touch MBA, it was going to a conference and seeing dozens of people making great livings online, selling the most random things: cat furniture, sewing kits, art websites. I mean, coming from a corporate background and then working at a business school, I just didn't have an idea that this was possible, right? So that completely shifted my perspective when I saw these really amazing entrepreneurs in these niches that were just so random to me. So that was a big career moment for me. So what was that career moment for you, or life moment for you, that really shifted your perspective? Maybe it was a conversation with a family member or a friend, or your participation at an event or one weekend, whatever it was. So that's one question you should ask. A second question you can ask is, how can you violate AdCom's expectations in a pleasing way as they're reading your story? So again, the Russian BCG consultant who's a professional wrestler, the silicon chip engineer who spends his weekend taking photographs, the doctor struggling to treat her own autoimmune disease. These are all ways of keeping the attention of your reader and violating their expectations in a pleasing way. So this was a really fun concept for me. And yeah, I really did stay up that whole night just thinking about this new story structure and how I could use it not only in our business, but in the way I tell my own stories and in life itself. Maybe there's not a big conflict that we have to struggle so mightily to overcome. Maybe it's just changing our perspective. I hope you don't think I'm too crazy for sharing this concept with you. And if you do have success with it, do let me know. I think it's really interesting and experimental and could lead to really different and unique MBA applications for you. So until next week, take care.
Thanks for listening to the Touch MBA podcast. Don't be shy. We have a mailing list. Go to touchmba.com and get yourself signed up. And we'll keep you posted with the best tips and insider interviews on how to get into your #1 school. You can also find us on Twitter and Facebook at Touch MBA. See you soon.